Thomas Francis Neale was a New Zealand bushcraft and survival enthusiast who, unlike the other castaway stories I have here on my channel, chose this himself. He spent much of his life in the Cook Islands, a total of 16 years and 3 sessions, living alone on an island of the Suwarrow atoll, the first 2 of which were the basis of his popular autobiography, An Island To Oneself. Even though being a father of 4, or maybe even 6 children, he was an absentee father following his dream to the bitter end, making his daughter Jean later say,
"He was a man apart, but also a man of his day, committed to one thing, another South Pacific adventure. To understand him, you have to see him in that light."
This is the incredible story about Tom Neale, the self-chosen castaway. This is Castaway History with Magnus. But before we begin, please smash that subscribe button and put on all notifications and blah, blah, blah. Having a curious mind and a sense of adventure, Tom Neale found his calling in life during World War II, where he had served in the Royal New Zealand Navy. With them, he had traveled around the Pacific Islands and seen many which were uninhabited, sparking his interest to live an alternative lifestyle. In 1945, Neale had the opportunity to visit the Suwarrow atoll briefly when a ship dropped in stores for the World War II coast watchers living there. He was enchanted by the Anchorage Island and decided that this was the place he wanted to live. A few years later, in 1952, he had an opportunity to book a passage on a ship passing close to Suwarrow, which had been uninhabited since the end of the war. The boat dropped him off with 2 cats and all the supplies he could scrape together on the islet of Anchorage, about a mile long and a few hundred feet wide. A hut with water tanks, some books, and a badly damaged boat was all that remained from the habitation by the coast watchers. He would have to work hard if he were to survive. The coast watchers had also left wild pigs and chickens on the atoll, but the pigs were a problem because they destroyed vegetation and made planting a garden impossible. Neale built a hunting stand in a tree and speared the pigs over the course of several months. He planted a garden, domesticated the chickens that had been left, and repaired the boat. For the most part, he lived on fish, crayfish, chicken, eggs, pawpaw, coconut, and breadfruit, the plant that the Bounty so famously was supposed to carry to the West Indies. Check out my video for more on that. It should be said that Suwarrow has been best known for having a buried pirate treasure, and some people even suggest that this was the real reason Neale went to the island, to find it. A Tahitian salvage ship is said to have sunk off Anchorage Islet in the late 19th century, with a chest full of Spanish gold coins, worth around $20 million in today's value. The New Zealand wanderer Henry Mayer found uncovered jeweled necklaces in the sand when a turtle was digging its nest. Unfortunately, Mayer was murdered shortly after that in the New Hebrides, taking the exact location with him to the grave. 10 months after arriving at Suwarrow, Neale's oneness and solitude was broken when he had his first visitors. 2 couples on a yacht, whom had been told of Neale's whereabouts by the British consul in Tahiti, was asked to check in on him to see that everything was okay with him. They stayed a couple of nights as his guests and helped him come up with a new plan to rebuild the pier, which had been built during the Second World War, but had been wrecked by a hurricane in 1942. It took him a total of 6 months of hard labor to fix the pier. But then disaster struck because the day after he completed the restoration of the pier, a major storm hit the islet, destroying all his hard labor in one stormy night. In May 1954, Neale injured his back when he was throwing the anchor from his boat. He was able to return to his hut on the opposite side of the atoll, but with great difficulty and pain, and lay semi-paralyzed for 4 days. As luck would have it, a couple on a yacht arrived at the atoll not knowing of his existence, discovered him, and were able to nurse him back to health. They notified the Cook Islands government, who sent a ship that took him back 2 weeks later. Although Neale thought at the time his back problem was a slipped disc, it was actually arthritis. Neale wished to return to Suwarrow once his back was healed, but the government refused him since they did not want the responsibility for him. As a consequence of his return to the Cook Islands, he met a woman Suwarrow, and married her in June 1956. They had 2 children together, Arthur and Stella. However, these were not the only children Tom Neale had, because Neale had 2 children in the Cook Islands before them, named John and Jean, and quite possibly 2 more in Tahiti before that. Because when he had at first returned to Rarotonga with the intention of getting some money, he had taken up an offer of becoming manager of a general store. He met a local woman, Akarapo, and is said to have 2 children with her too. So this may be his 5th and 6th child, as he quite possibly fathered 2 more in Tahiti before that. This new son later became John Britgard, taking his surname from one of Tom's friends, Richard Britgard, who later adopted him as part of his own family, just like the Polynesians often do. In April 1960, he returned to the atoll, again alone and without his family, but this time with more extensive provisions. During this stay, one of his visitors came from a passing American warship by one of their helicopters. The helicopter could only stay half an hour before the ship was out of range, so it was a short visit, but it was through them that British author Noel Barber heard of Neale's life on the island. Noel Barber was fascinated by the story of Neale's life on the island and paid him a visit. A car crash ended his career as journalist, and he began writing novels and wrote the introduction to the later book about Neale, An Island to Oneself. 14 months later, his next visit was from an old friend from Rarotonga, investigating rumors that Neale had died, something he clearly hadn't. Many months later, another yacht visited with a couple and their daughter, who would get an unforeseen long stay at the island. Because a squall hit the lagoon the first night they were there, and the yacht's anchoring cable parted, and it was filled with water and stranded on a reef. The 3 lived with Neale, who helped them survive for a few months on the island, before they successfully were able to signal the passing ship with a mirror, and the family was rescued. In 1963, after 3.5 years on the island, Neale returned to Rarotonga, complaining that a group of pearl divers were coming to Suwarrow to hunt for pearls, and being the person he was, he found their presence increasingly hard to tolerate, but later saying,
"Predominant reason was a very simple one. I realized I was getting old, and the prospect of the lonely death did not particularly appeal to me."
He met with author Robert Dean Frisbee in Rarotonga, and he was entranced by his life and story of the atoll of Suwarrow. He later wrote the autobiography together with Neale, where he recounts his life through his first and second stay on the atoll, and the book sold very well. This allowed Neale to fund a much greater store of provisions for his next stay. In Neale's absence, a number of others visited and had taken up temporary residence on the island. In 1964, June Van Donop, a former accountant from Honolulu, lived alone in his house on Suwarrow for a week. In 1965 and 66, Michael Swift lived alone on Suwarrow, but he was not familiar with survival techniques and had a hard time finding sufficient food. Another visitor, a former student, Howard Usesh, left a message for him, though I have not been able to find out what he wrote. Neale returned to the atoll in June 1967 and stayed alone there for 10 years, until 1977, when he was found very ill by people on a yacht and taken to Rarotonga. However, there are very little information about this stay because when he came there, he was diagnosed with stomach cancer. He opted for treatment by the controversial Dr. Milan Breish, who had fled New Zealand to practice his controversial treatment in the Cook Islands. After treatment by Milan Breish, Tom Neale died 8 months later. His grave is in the Arce Cemetery on Rarotonga, opposite the airport. Today, Suwarrow in the northern Cook Islands has National Heritage Park status. 2 rangers spend half the year there, living in the same hut built by the coast watchers which Neale used. Remember to press that subscribe button and put on all notifications so you don't miss the next time I upload a new video. And please give this a thumbs up and check out my other videos to see if there are more you find interesting. And I hope to see you in the next one.